Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to our webcast where we're going to ask Malcolm Hawker anything. Over the last week or so, you will know this because you've signed up for this, but we asked for questions to be submitted. And we have a lot of questions all queued up, and we're going to run through them in as expedient a manner as possible. You feel free to use the Q&A chat. We'll do whatever we can to catch up with those, but we have a lot of pre-submitted questions that we're going to run through. So let's do some introductions, and we'll get started. So I'm Martin Voigt, VP Product Marketing here at Profisee, but the star of the show, of course, is Malcolm Hawker. Say hi, Malcolm.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Hi.
There you are. Thank you. So Malcolm, you probably know, Malcolm is recently with Gartner. He was 3 years as working in the MDM space with Gartner as an analyst and co-author of the Magic Quadrant for 3 years. And he just recently joined Profisee in the last few weeks. And we'll get into a little bit of that, I think, when we get into the questions. Malcolm has been on all sides of the MDM data governance and data question. He has been on the vendor side. He was a consultant. He's been a buyer of all this technology. Then he spent 3 years at Gartner talking about it. In that context, co-authoring the Magic Quadrant, he got to speak to a lot of vendors, got to speak to a lot of clients, a lot of people who were considering MDM or were troubled by MDM or all angles on the whole topic. So in the last 3 years, he's probably spent as much time thinking and talking about master data management as anybody on the planet. And now he's joined Profisee as head of data strategy. But in effect, Malcolm's here to be an evangelist to deal with all things to do with the value of master data management in some shape or form. And I think you'll get a good bearing on that as we jump into the questions. So let's get started. So we took all 100. There was over 100 questions. We grouped a lot of them into 5 different areas because a lot of them kind of group naturally that way. The first area is around MDM Program Dependencies. So the kind of questions we have in here, just to name a few, I haven't listed all of them, but name 5 best practices of companies that are doing superb MDM. What considerations do we need to make in prepping for MDM? What do organizations get right and not get right? What's the most common hurdles? What are the biggest obstacles? Et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is something that, Malcolm, you probably dealt with a lot at Gartner. So tell us what you think. How do you group all that stuff together and start answering it?
Well, thanks so much for the intro, Martin. Really, really appreciate it. Hello, everybody. Great to see some familiar faces showing up for today's event. Just a few disclaimers. One, I'm dialing in from Austin, Texas, USA today. It is the height of allergy season here. And I'm suffering horrible allergies. So if you hear me go on mute and you see me sneezing over the sides, it's very likely that I will be sneezing today. Yeah, don't take it personally. It's not the subject that makes me sleepy or gives me a histamine response. It's just simply all the oak pollen in the air. Actually did see somebody in the attendee list from dialing from UT, University of Texas here as well. He or she would know exactly what I'm talking about. So that's one disclaimer. Another one is that I am fueled by caffeine and I will be taking sips every now and then. But I'm really excited everybody's here. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to have a conversation with me. And thank you so much for submitting these questions. Really looking forward to digging into these issues with you today. Top 5 MDM program dependencies. This is the question that I probably got the most often as a Gartner analyst. What do we need to do to succeed, or what are the pitfalls that we need to avoid? Basically the same question, different sides of the same coin. Number one, you've got to have some form of an MDM strategy, and you have to have some sort of understanding of what your approach is. The key here, guys, is to know what success looks like. Where are you going to focus? You can't do all things at once. So what are the 1 or the 2 or the 3 business problems that you want to solve? You don't want to solve 8 or 9 or 10. You want to solve 1 or 2 or 3 and be very, very focused on defining a strategy related to those specific business outcomes that we'll talk a little bit more about. So don't try to be all things to all people. Be very focused on the outcomes that you're trying to drive. This leads to number 2, having some notion of a quantified business case. It is so important for a lot of different reasons. A big reason being having a business case will help you refine your scope, which is number 3 success factor here. Another thing is the business case will help you set expectations with your stakeholders. It'll help you be able to prove to the business you've actually delivered value. So often I see companies invest in MDM, they move the needle, they improve their data, they drive outcomes from the business perspective, but they can't actually prove it. So then some new CFO comes or a new CEO is hired, a new CIO is hired, and they look at the money being spent on data governance or an MDM and they say, why is all that money going out the door? And can you prove the ROI of your program? And if you can't, then your program is immediately at risk, even if you did get it off the ground. Business case, so important, guys. Number 3, I already touched on this, scope. Managing your scope is critical for MDM program success. Again, you need to be razor focused on the delivery of specific business outcomes. Be limited in your scope. If you're just trying to get an MDM program off the ground, you don't need to break all silos. Break 1 or 2 or 3 silos, but don't focus on breaking all silos. This does kind of dovetail into the notion of, do I take a domain approach, and which domain should I be focused on? We'll talk about that a little bit more. But spoiler alert, don't take a domain approach. I'll talk about that a little bit more as we continue on these discussions here. Number 4, governance. You need some form of data governance, whether you formalize it or whether you don't. You will need to focus on data governance. All those requirements, all the business rules that you are going to manage as a part of this MDM program, those business rules are the foundation of a governance program. They speak to policies and procedures that should be managed vis-a-vis a data governance program. How do I define quality? How do I define a unique record? These are all, yes, they're MDM requirements, but they're also governance policies and procedures. Lastly, executive sponsorship. So important. You need somebody with a very big title in your corner supporting this initiative. And you also need to make sure that you have incentives aligned correctly. I see so often, I'll talk with companies, I'll talk with a leader of an MDM program, and I'll say, well, who's your executive stakeholder? They'll say, well, CIO is behind this all the way. That's our executive stakeholder. CIO is fully aligned, and all the C-suite is fully aligned. Well, that's fantastic. The C-suite is fully aligned. Have they aligned to your business case? Well, I haven't created a business case. Okay, that's a little bit of a problem. But when we get into MDM, what we end up seeing is that yes, the C-suite executives kind of signed off at some executive offsite and they said, yeah, I'll do this. Yes, that sounds good. Let's do this. But when you actually start to make some process changes, when you start to change the way that you manage customer data or product data, all of a sudden you see people say, whoa, wait a minute, I didn't sign up for that. So this kind of speaks to that business case and how important it is. But those are the top 5 dependencies for MDM program success. I hope I touched on all of these, and I imagine that there'll be more questions that kind of spawn out of this, but those are the things that I'd be most aware of when launching MDM.
Perfect. And since you just ended up on aligning around business value, the next questions, or the next group of questions, the next broad topic is around business value. How do you connect the business outcomes to the data? So just a sampling of some of those questions here. How do I measure the value of adding an MDM solution, the business case to mobilize and engage the business? What common metrics do you find most valuable for a business looking to start MDM? What's the best domain to build first? The cost of bad data, etc. So I won't read all of them. So the broad topic of engaging folks around a common business case.
Yeah, again, cannot overstress the importance of tying what you do from an MDM and a governance perspective back to some notion of business outcomes and having some form of a business case. The first thing that I almost always heard as a Gartner analyst when I started talking about business case was something to the effect of, I'm paraphrasing, well, Malcolm, that sounds fine, but that's impossible. Right? Because all the impacts here are indirect. How can you make a claim that improving your data quality for customer product will have a bottom line impact on revenue, for example? And my answer to that would be, if you model this the right way and if you follow best practices, you absolutely positively can make a connection between improvements in data and business outcomes, right? We'll talk about the how here as we progress forward, but this is really all about finding a way to start at the top of this pyramid. I love to tell this story through the lens of this pyramid. So often what I see is companies embark on MDM or governance. They'll go hire some consultants. Consultants love these projects, by the way, because they can take an awfully long time if you don't do them the right way. If you don't have refined scope, if you don't have defined business outcomes, consultants love those programs, by the way. Don't get me wrong, I've hired lots and lots of consultants. They're very close friends of mine. I was a consultant, so I know how this works. But the consultants get hired and they will dive into the bottom of this pyramid, right? Without any sort of specific guidance around a business case or around scope, what they'll do is they will profile all your data. They will catalog all your data. They'll glossary all your data. And then 4, 5, 6 months goes by and you have very, very little to show for it. So instead, what we recommend is to start at the top with some idea of what you want the business outcomes to be. Again, focusing on 1 or 2 or 3 very, very specific outcomes. And in this case, I gave an outcome of increased customer satisfaction. Now, this is where you'd be asking, well, hey, wait a minute, improving data, can we actually prove that we improved our customer satisfaction by improving the data? Yes, you can. If you work your way down this pyramid, the next level down is fairly high-level metrics that you use to measure customer satisfaction. Things like customer retention, maybe your customer lifetime value, maybe a net promoter score even. Below that, there are individual KPIs. This is just one KPI. Chances are you've probably got 10, 20, maybe even 100 KPIs that all link to some form of customer satisfaction metric. But sitting underneath that KPI is literally a formula. Service inquiries per customer. Maybe that's one way that you measure customer satisfaction, the number of times they call for support or help. Sitting under that is a field of data, right at the bottom of this model, customer. So you can use this model to say, okay, what are the outcomes we're trying to drive? Increase customer satisfaction. You can go all the way from a high level way that like a C-level executive or an SVP would be articulating a business challenge. You can work all the way down into individual fields of data. From there, you need to make sure that you're tracking kind of 2 things, right? You're going to have these business metrics like customer satisfaction, improved net promoter score, increase customer retention, you name it. Those are business metrics that you need to be tracking as a part of a governance and MDM initiative. And you also need to be tracking data quality metrics, kind of more IT-centric metrics. So often I see my customers only focus on those data quality metrics, and they don't link them at all to those business metrics. You need to be managing both as a part of an MDM program, right? And you need to work with the right people in your business units, work with the right stakeholders to help model the impacts of improvements of that customer data or product data or whatever those fields of data that you want to focus on. Build a model that says, if we reduce our duplicate rate, for example, or if we increase our customer data accuracy, what % impact will that have on driving down the service inquiries per customer in this case, right? Yes, you can model this stuff. If you find the right people, you can build a model that says if we improve our customer data by X %, it will have a Y % impact on our overall customer satisfaction. It absolutely positively can be done. It's not easy. You do need to work with the right people on the business side. You do need to sit down and collaborate with them and work on these models. Once you have that business case, you're going to present it back to the stakeholders, and that'll be your yardstick for measuring your success in an MDM program. But so important.
Well, one thing I've heard, Malcolm, I'm interested in your comment here. A good way of defining the objective or knowing that you've come up with a meaningful business objective is you can state it without using the word data. Does that resonate?
That's a real challenge for people like us, right? They live and breathe in the data world. But yeah, if you can articulate an MDM-related business problem without saying data, yes, absolutely. I love it. The one example that I probably gave the most when I was a Gartner analyst was increase of cross-sell or increased upsell or identification of white space, of net new qualified leads, right? Or we suffer from an inability to quickly and accurately identify sales qualified leads. May not sound like an MDM problem, but it absolutely could be facilitated or enabled with MDM, absolutely. And I love that use case, cross-sell, upsell, because chances are people in your marketing organization already have models defined that say, you know what, if we have one more qualified lead, we're going to sell X more units of our product. Chances are those models already exist, and you're not going to have any argument internally about whether they are accurate or inaccurate because they're already there and the business is already running on them. So yes, you can articulate, the more that you can articulate MDM through a business-centric lens, right? Whether that's in a business case, whether that's in a narrative, whether that's in you telling somebody in the lunchroom what you do for a living, the more that you can explain it through the lens of business and the way that business people speak, the better it's going to be for you, the easier it's going to be for you, the more likely you are to get stakeholder support, the more likely you are to get people who want to do things like data cleanups, right? So yes, avoid putting things through the lens of data, because you know what? One of the hardest lessons I ever learned here was that the business doesn't care about data quality. Sad truth. They just don't. They care about customer retention. They care about selling more widgets. They care about improving their supply chain efficiency. That's what the business cares about. So if you can articulate things through those lenses, better it's going to be for you.
Perfect. And just one follow up from the chat. Does it matter if the C sponsor is business or IT to the whole conversation we're having here and to the chart on the screen?
It doesn't matter. The short answer is it doesn't matter from an executive sponsorship perspective. What matters is to have active and engaged sponsorship. What you don't want is to have somebody say, yep, I sponsor it and I've allocated budget to it, but then you never see he or she again, right? What you want is an engaged and active senior sponsor here, right? Somebody that is going to, at the very least, monthly governance meetings, that at the very least is active in the program, is getting active updates, understands the problems that are trying to be solved through the implementation of MDM and governance. So there's a difference between somebody just cutting a check, which I see often, and having an executive who actually has active ongoing engagement in the program. You really, really want the latter.
Excellent. All right, thank you. So let's, we're on a good pace here. Let's jump to the next topic, which is MDM and Data Fabric's data mesh, topics that are coming up increasingly in the data world. So let's touch on them a little bit. How does Profisee promote the data fabric? What's your vision on MDM and data meshes in relation to industry clouds? How data mesh architecture affects MDM, data fabric. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yep. Let's spend just a couple of minutes at a high level talking about these things. Putting on kind of my Gartner analyst hat, these are two separate things. They're two separate kind of architectural patterns. That's something to keep in mind here, is that, you know, what a Gartner analyst would tell you here is that you can't go buy a data fabric and you can't go buy a data mesh. These are inherently architectural patterns. These are data management patterns that across both of these largely follow kind of decentralized pattern. The data mesh is a decentralized pattern that allows domain-centric management of business rules and governance rules related to data that is supporting that domain. That domain could be literally a data domain, or it could be a department, or it could be a region. It doesn't matter. Domain is a little bit of a catch-all here, but is a decentralized pattern of data management that recognizes the notion that context matters, right? Meaning that customer data in a legal or accounting or finance context is different than customer data from a sales and marketing context, right? And this is really kind of what the data mesh does. It acknowledges this and allows for kind of, you know, what is often called more of adaptive forms of governance, where the business rules for domain one may be different than the business rules for domain two. The data fabric, on the other hand, is all about metadata and the use of metadata to start to enable the data to inform its own management and its own governance, right? Where the patterns that exist within metadata could potentially be used to start automating things related to data governance, data integration, even data quality rules, where the metadata would start to tell you, okay, this is what's happening in the data. These transactions are successful, they're not successful. So maybe you should think about rule A, or maybe you should think about rule B. So it's more of a centralized, you could argue a data fabric is a little bit more of a centralized pattern, but at the end of the day, these are architectural patterns for data management. What I would argue is that you cannot do either effectively without MDM. Because at the end of the day, particularly from a data mesh perspective, if your CEO asks you, how many customers do we have? There can only be one answer, right? Context is fantastic at operating levels of the organization. Context matters to a marketer versus an accountant, right? Those things matter. But when you're at a higher level of the organization, there can only be one answer to the question, how many customers do we have? So this means that there is still a place for master data management. There is still a place for a single view or a single accurate aggregated number of customers, products, employees, assets. Pick your data domain here. It really doesn't matter. All that decentralization is great. All that domain centricity is great because it allows a certain amount of flexibility from an operating perspective, which is exactly what we want, which is, by the way, one of the future directions of MDM, which is this notion of highly contextual uses of data and management of data. But again, at higher levels of the organization, if you have to put together a financial report that says, how many customers do we have, or you're reporting things to Wall Street, there can't be multiple answers. There can't be, well, it depends. Sorry, boss, it depends. I can't give you one answer. That's probably giving that answer of I can't give you one answer, there are multiple answers, is probably what led you to MDM in the first place, right? So whether it is a data fabric or a data mesh, you need MDM, right? In the case of a data mesh, you need an MDM to provide that single common place for data that is shared widely, particularly from more of a corporate or an HQ perspective. In the case of the data fabric, I'll be honest, guys, I see a lot of hand waving right now in conversations related to the data fabric about data governance, about implementation and management of these business rules. It's one thing to say, hey, we're going to let some robots define, or some algorithms or some highly tuned knowledge graphs define our data governance policies. It's easy to say that kind of from a future state perspective, and we'll get there in 3 to 4 years from now. But in practice, for most of us, that's a little bit too far-fetched, if you ask me. There is still a role here for having data business rules, for having common data definitions, common data structures from an MDM perspective. All the core business drivers that would lead an organization to need MDM are still going to be there in a data fabric environment, right? So even if you run a knowledge graph, and a knowledge graph tells you all sorts of things about the data that you didn't necessarily know before, okay, well, that's great. Now, what are the business rules going to be for the distribution of that data, for the accessing that data, for the quality and consistency of that data? So even with a data fabric, and even with knowledge graphs, and even with AI, garbage in, garbage out, right? If the data going into that fabric is inconsistent, is low quality, is untrustworthy, all the robots in the world are not going to necessarily be able to solve for that, because there are exceptions in the data that they won't know how to handle. I would argue that they won't know how to handle. Can we get to the point somewhere down the road where the robots are smart enough that they could deal with all these exceptions and just intuitively know what the right answer is? Maybe, but we're probably years, if not decades, away from that. So MDM is foundational to both data fabric and data mesh. I would argue you cannot do one without the other. In a data fabric environment, MDM will play an important role from helping. And yes, I think that there is a role here for metadata to what we call augment data management policies and procedures, data governance policies and procedures, where I think there's some really, really cool stuff going on in the world of active metadata, where knowledge graphs are telling you things about the data that you didn't know before. The example I always give in conversations with my customers in the past was maybe the notion of something like a household, where you have two different people, or a family, for example. Family relationships are a great use case here to help you to understand what active metadata might be, where if you're just looking at individual transactions, you may not be able to understand that Joe Smith and Sally Brown are actually part of the same family. I live in a mixed family where we have multiple names in this family, right? Even multiple addresses. But would it be good as a marketer to understand where there is a family relationship there? Well, yeah, that's cool. And you can do that using graph. And then you have to make some decisions about, okay, well, how are we going to manage this data? How are we going to manage the relationship? How are we going to manage the hierarchy here? What are the data quality rules? What are some of the data definitions here? And there is no way that you're going to fully automate those decisions outside any form of formal MDM program. So data fabric, data mesh, I would argue successfully doing either requires a foundation of MDM.
Agreed. And just as an anecdote here, we've been talking about these concepts for a while and how MDM fits with them. We even had some Gartner inquiries around this, not with Malcolm, but with somebody else in Gartner. And when you challenge them on, don't you need MDM? The answer is kind of, well, yeah, of course. And it's just so foundational. It's so deeply underneath this. As a foundation, it's so deeply underpinning all these other ideas, which are cool and sexy and interesting and leverage advanced technologies. But everything in IT at some level is garbage in, garbage out. And if you don't have a proper, call it semantic understanding, you don't have a master data fabric that glues all the other parts of it together, then none of it will work very well. So even although a lot of the conversation at conferences and things are about automatic discovery of metadata and inference of this and that, if the data itself isn't good enough, then everything else is going to start to fall apart.
Couldn't agree more. So the people that you're talking about at Gartner are close friends of mine that I talk to all the time. And in early versions of the data fabric graphics that they were producing, there was some notion of what they would call a semantic layer, which is just a fancy way of saying MDM, right? Common definitions, right? In future versions of data fabric graphics that I've seen, that's no longer there. And there's a lot of hand waving going on right now about how to manage for things like data quality and data consistency, and allowing for widespread data sharing from the perspective of MDM, where it's, okay, the fabric will figure that out. Well, okay, that's great, but who's going to be defining all those business rules? It comes right back to MDM. I totally agree. Garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly. It's a very old concept, but it hasn't gone away.
No, it's not going away. It's relevant.
Yeah. Hey, a quick question from the chat, Malcolm. A little bit tangential. Do you know of a published standard for common industry, business terminology, and aligned business area stewardship?
There are a few industry-specific sources that I'm vaguely aware of. There are third-party providers of data that do a reasonably good job here. At a high level, you could partner with like a Dun & Bradstreet or Experian or an Epsilon or other third-party data providers to say, okay, what does a business record typically look like? What are some standard fields of data that we usually typically see on maybe example a B2B record or a B2C record? So there are some third-party data providers that can help turbocharge efforts here. There are a few kind of very, very specialist data providers in the manufacturing space, in the logistics spaces, and a few others, oil and gas as well, where they are selling information related to kind of standard approaches, standard taxonomies and terminology related to very, very use case specific data sets, but probably have to take that one offline. The short answer is there are a few. There are a few, but there is really kind of no silver bullet here to a lot of the hard work that needs to go in from a data modeling and a data architecture perspective. Ultimately, it comes right back to what do you want your outcomes to be, right? And what do you want to accomplish from an MDM perspective, and use those outcomes to sculpt and define your architecture, define your data models, define your business rules, define your governance rules, and try to avoid the temptation of taking kind of the bottoms up approach where you're just looking at all your data and saying, okay, is there a way that I can automate data modeling or automate taxonomies or ontologies within the data? Because chances are there isn't.
Excellent. So that kind of leads a little bit into the next topic, which is a big one. It's already come up in the chat. Data governance framework and organization for MDM. So governance and MDM at some level going hand in hand, but that's what you're going to talk about. So questions, implementation of governance in a framework and an organization, blueprint for rolling out governance, bottom-up versus top-down approach to governance, governance framework, best practices around governance, how to implement a robust governance process. So the floor is yours, Malcolm. Let's talk about governance.
Yeah, this slide is a little busy, and apologies for that. But let's talk first about kind of implementing data governance. We'll share the next slide is a little more of a kind of a framework type slide with the things that you need to be thinking about. But when it comes to governance, you can do governance without MDM, but you can't do MDM without governance. These things are intrinsically intertwined. And if you are embarking on an MDM program, or maybe in the middle of one, governance needs to absolutely be at the top of your priority list. See the first slide that I shared. I was often asked the question of, well, what does kind of data governance committee look like? What does data governance look like? Who owns master data? Boy, if I had $1 for every time I was asked who owned master data, I'd have a lot of dollars. A few things that you should take away from this slide. When it comes to data governance, there is no one single owner within the organization, right? Master data by definition is data that is shared widely across the organization and is used widely across the organization. So the notion of a single owner when it comes to master data is a little bit of a misnomer, right? Data and data policies and procedures, particularly governance policies and procedures, can be defined at any level of the organization, but typically we look at it through this lens here of 3 levels. A global level, and I kind of chopped off a Venn diagram here on the right side of the screen here, but this is a Venn diagram. Data governance policies can be defined at a global level, more of a regional level, or at an application level. When it comes to master data is typically either regional data or global data. It's data that is shared widely across the organization. And when data is being shared widely, the ownership, again, the notion of ownership really it contains 2 things. It contains policy definition, right? And it contains policy enforcement. It's very, very, very rare that policies would be defined by one person or one organization, enforced by one person and one organization at an enterprise-wide level for all use cases. That would follow more of a centralized data governance pattern, which most companies are not trying to do anymore, and it would probably follow a pattern of a relatively small company where there wasn't a lot of data being widely shared. So again, this notion of like ownership with one person or one department is a little bit of a misnomer here, because keep in mind, there's 2 things going on here. One is policies are being defined and policies are being enforced. And they can be defined at any level and they can be enforced at any level. You can have a global data governance policy that applies to everybody enterprise-wide, right? You could have more of a regional, what I'd call a regional data governance policy that may only be affecting a couple of groups, maybe 2 or 3 operating groups. But it's important to keep in mind that you know these definitions exist and these splits exist. Down at the bottom is more of an application level data, right? Where you know, let's just take a CRM. In any customer record in a CRM, there could be 200 fields of data. You know, probably 4 or 5 or 6 of those would be considered more global. Some of them would be a little bit more regional in notion, maybe than where a contract, for example, where the data is only being shared between the CRM and maybe the ERP. That would be example of more regional data. But where most of the fields in that customer record sitting in the CRM system would be considered application data, where the rules for that could be defined entirely locally, right? So the people that are doing these definitions, the people that are coming up with these policies and procedures, are typically sitting in some form of a data governance committee, a global data governance committee, a regional governance committee, or some application level governance committee, right? So at each level, there can actually be data stewards, right? I didn't put them in on the bottom level, but they could certainly even be data stewards sitting at the bottom level as well. You could have data stewards sitting at more of an HQ or a corporate-wide level that are enforcing, that are helping define those policies, but also helping to enforce them. That can absolutely happen. We see this a lot with customer-related data or other kind of global elements that are being managed on a more central basis. Same thing is true from more of a regional approach, where you could actually have data stewards that are defining more of these regional defined rules. So who does what is a function of your data governance policies and procedures. The kind of the where the lines are drawn here would be defined in your data governance policies and procedures, which would be a reflection of your overall MDM and governance strategy and your overall approach. Generally following a pattern of, do you want to be centralized or do you want to be decentralized at a high level? Most companies that I'm talking to day in and day out want to be highly decentralized, because again, they are recognizing that context matters, right? That it's okay to have customer data in a sales and marketing system say one thing, and customer data in a finance or accounting system say maybe something slightly different. That's okay, right? But where you do have to resolve those differences when it comes to more of a, you know, from a global perspective. So most companies I'm talking to are trying to push towards more of these decentralized patterns, but then overlaying centralized business process management over top of it with this notion of ownership. Okay, well, we're going to have decentralized customer data management. We'll allow people to do in sales and what they want to do, or we'll allow people in accounting to do what they want to do, but then we're going to define a single owner. Well, that's not going to work, right? How do you have a single owner where you've got decentralized data management happening at very local levels? Not going to, that governance model is not going to work. So a few things to take away here. Keep in mind that governance can be defined, you know, is 2 things: is governance policies and is governance policy enforcement. And they can happen at multiple levels, and that it's okay that it happens at multiple levels. Typically, the policies, the rules are being defined by these committees. Typically, these committees are higher level people within each of these levels. From a global level, we're generally talking VPs and SVPs. From a regional level, we're generally talking senior directors and VPs, right? So some things to keep in mind from a kind of an overall approach. You know, what does an organization look like? I would hear that all the time. I think we can leave it with that from a governance perspective. Lots more here potentially to discuss offline, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But we want to talk about more of a framework. Martin, maybe if we could advance the slides.
Just one clarification before we move to the next slide, Malcolm. So you said you can do governance without MDM, but not MDM without governance. I broadly agree with that, but just to clarify, does that mean that someone, an organization, should go buy a governance tool set and spend 6 or 12 months implementing that before they do MDM, or how does, just to make sure that we're all understanding this correctly?
Thanks for the question. So governance inherently is a business discipline, right? As is MDM. MDM is inherently a discipline. There are software tools that can help automate, help manage those disciplines in the form of MDM software or governance software. Often, most of the companies that I'm talking to will end up purchasing some software, but you don't necessarily need it, right? You can get an early stage MDM program off the ground without, I know I work for a software provider, so my boss should cover his ears, but you can get an early stage MDM program off the ground without having MDM software, and you can certainly get a governance program off the ground without having MDM software, right? Yep. Absolutely doable. You could create some very basic data governance policies and procedures that do things like define my quality standards, define my data definitions, define sharing rules, and on and on, but like just a limited number of governance policies, right? And you can do that from an MDM perspective as well. The very, very first MDM that I ever stood up didn't require a lot of expensive software. Yes, it was on Excel. It was an Excel spreadsheet where I defined some very, very basic data quality rules for uniqueness in customer data. Here are the business rules that I will use to define a unique customer. They were really, really basic, and they were doing things like, okay, if the first name and the last name are the same and the first 3 characters of the address field are the same, those are data governance policies. As crude as they may sound, those are still data governance policies. And I was doing a lot of that stuff in Excel. Didn't produce great results, wasn't really scalable, wasn't very flexible, but it was better than nothing. And I was actually able to establish kind of a single version of the truth, as it were, just having customer data sitting in an Excel file. So again, probably not what most of the people on this call need, probably not the flexibility or the scalability or the configurability that you're going to need in today's modern businesses. But yeah, you can do MDM in Excel, and you can apply governance rules against it as well.
Yeah. So and the way I would say all of that is, if you're embarking on an MDM journey, you're going to have to make decisions that are ultimately governance decisions before you can implement MDM. What are your data quality rules? What should my customer look like? What should my product look like, et cetera? You can benefit from a governance platform if you have one, but you shouldn't spend an awful lot of time or money buying one before you embark on that journey. It'll help, but it's not necessarily a prerequisite. And a shameless plug here, I'll just drop in that every bi-weekly we do a live demo where we talk a lot about governance and our integration with Purview, for anyone who's familiar with Microsoft Purview is Microsoft's governance platform. So we have a lot to say on this in terms of software and implementation. So feel free to join that conversation if you want to.
That's a great. That's a great
part of this.
It's a great dovetail, because what I was about to say, and I think where you were kind of going here, is what I recommend from a governance perspective. If you are focused on MDM, if MDM is your core business problem, right? If you lack a single version of the truth, if you lack a customer master record, and you are focused on MDM, from a governance perspective, what I would absolutely positively recommend, kind of getting back to that pyramid that I was sharing before, that's why I have another one here, is to take a little bit more of an MVP, minimum viable product, more of an agile approach. If I got the question all the time, kind of this chicken and egg of, okay, so that means I have to, governance is critical for MDM. That means I need to work on a governance program and stand up governance before I do MDM. Well, yes, but you don't have to do everything. Right? Like all the stuff on the right-hand side, business value, strategy, culture, ethics, trust, policy, literacy, becoming data-driven, all of these things. Do you need to do all of that for all domains, all data, all databases, all tables? No. That's a multi-year thing. I mean, to do all of that, to establish an enterprise class governance program that addresses all of the kind of these the components of the framework here on the right-hand side, you're talking years and years, guys. So if you want to get an MDM program off the ground, take kind of an MVP type approach and say, okay, here are my defined outcomes. I want to build MDM. I want to deploy MDM to enable better cross-selling and upselling of my products. Hard stop. Really simple. We've got a very narrow scope and a very limited focus from an MDM program perspective. What is the governance I need to enable that outcome? It will touch on each of these frameworks, but it won't touch on every field of data. It won't touch on every table. It won't touch on every process, every workflow. That's how you take more of an agile approach here from a governance perspective. Can you carve this into small bite-sized chunks where you're defining the governance policies and procedures that are needed to enable that outcome, right? And if you do enable that outcome, then do it again for a second outcome, and then do it again for a third outcome. By the time you get to outcome, I don't know, 100, you'll have filled in all the blanks. You'll have defined all of your governance policies and procedures, but you will have done it in a way that enables value to be delivered to the business incrementally, slowly but surely, where the business doesn't have to wait 3 years for you to define your governance program writ large, right? So don't get caught up in this trap of thinking that, oh, well, there's a chicken and egg. That means I need to go spend 2 years defining a governance program, right? No. Pick an outcome, focus on it, and be as agile as you can, be as MVP-centric as you can. Look at the second bullet here. I know this is a little bit heretical from an MDM and governance perspective, but avoid the temptation, guys, to be focused only on domains, right? I get asked all the time, what domain should I be focused on? That was one of the questions that came through previous to this session. What domain should I be focused on? Well, if you're following this strategy of delivering outcomes, your business stakeholders, the people that are cutting the checks internally here, are not incentivized on domain, right? Your chief revenue officer, your chief marketing officer does not have an incentive that says, we delivered a better customer domain. They are incented on delivering customer experience, delivering more sales, delivering products, reducing costs in your supply chain, right? None of those things have to do with the domain. Which then leads to the question of, but Malcolm, if I'm focused on more of a process, which is what I recommend, focus on processes that tie to business outcomes. The next question you're going to ask is, well, but that means I'm going to be crossing multiple domains, and that means it's going to be harder. It's going to be more complicated, because what you're saying here is that I have to take a multi-domain approach for phase 1 MDM. And I would argue that's okay if you're focused on that process. If you're focused on the specific outcomes and you get your stakeholders to align to them, then taking more of a process-centric approach instead of a domain-centric approach, I would argue, is a valid approach. Now, don't get me wrong, still, we have a lot of clients that are focused on domain and domain only, but it can just be really, really tough, particularly from a scope perspective, because you say, we're gonna focus on the customer domain. Well, customer data is everywhere, right? That means that you have to go on a profiling exercise of all fields, all tables, all rows that contain customer data, whether or not it's even valuable, whether or even not it helps define to drive that outcome that we were talking about. So be very, very careful when it comes to defining your scope from an MDM or a governance perspective. Remember, it's about outcomes. Remember, it's about delivering value incrementally over time. Another thing we don't really do very well here as IT people is ring our own bell, right? Celebrate successes. If you're able to do this, if you can stand up an MDM POC and deliver, let's say, a customer 360, or maybe even a customer 180 when all you had in the past was a customer 0, right? If you're able to show some value and actually move the needle, celebrate your successes, right? Show that to the organization. Publish what you've done and make it known what you've done and how you've enabled some of those business outcomes. This is a big part of becoming more data driven. And there's a notion here of data storytelling. One of my best friends is a gentleman named Scott Taylor, who you may have seen online. Scott and I go way, way, way back. And he's one of the best at data storytelling, right? So that should be part of what you have to do here. It's a part of literacy. It's a foundational element of a governance program. So yes, telling your story with data, avoid the use of the word data to try to tell your story. But this is all part of a governance framework here. And again, remember that start here with a goal in mind. Start with that outcome. Then you can dive into the catalog. Then you can dive into the kind of the purview level of the world and do the catalog and do the profiling. This is another thing about the data fabric that is a little bit, what I would say is give a bit of a cautionary message here, is that data catalogs are important. Don't get me wrong, really, really important. And they're kind of foundational to a data management strategy. But in and of themselves, they don't drive any value, right? In and of themselves, they don't drive any value. So don't just think that you need to go out and rush out and build a catalog at all costs. Yes, they're important. You will need a data catalog. But if you can take more of that outcome-centric approach to slowly build the catalog out over time, it'll make everything you do much more effective.
Excellent. Thank you. Lots of practical stuff there. And this is an enormous topic that we could spend a lot of time on and probably will more in the future. So last big topic, and then we'll move to the lightning round. So we need to keep our pace up here. MDM versus CDPs, customer data platforms. How do we establish the right balance between MDM and customer data platform? Refers a lot to what you were just talking about there about single domain stuff, Malcolm. To what extent do you see companies substituting CDP for MDM, and would CRMs be suitable to deliver MDM capabilities? What would be the challenges?
Short answer to Stephanie's question there. The short answer to Stephanie's question, the last one there, is no. I don't recommend CRMs as an MDM. I would recommend a CRM potentially as a marketing master or a sales master, but as an enterprise-wide master, CRM platforms are ill-suited to the task. A death by text here. Sorry, guys, I have a lot of text. We will be providing the this afterwards as a follow-up, so you'll have this to refer to offline. But the short answer here is customer data platforms are not built to be MDM platforms. Customer data platforms are built for marketers, right? These are marketer-friendly tools to be used by marketers to allow them to manage some of their own data integrations, to manage the creation of some form of a customer data hub for the use of creating a customer, a single view of the customer, shall we say, that can be used to support downstream marketing campaigns, activating marketing campaigns, as the marketers would say, right? So the story that I kind of like to tell here is that customer data platforms are very much the world of the unknown or the less known, lower quality data, higher volumes of data, less structured data, really not suitable for any sort of use cases outside of the marketing realm. You wouldn't ask anybody in finance or accounting or audit to rely on data in a customer data platform to make decisions about rev rec or to make decisions from more of a compliance perspective. You wouldn't expect a customer data platform to be used that way. Generally, in a customer data platform, the cost of being wrong is very low, right? Not optimal to have an inefficient marketing campaign or to send snail mail to the wrong person or multiple snail mails to the same address, that kind of thing. Certainly not optimal, but the costs there are generally fairly low. MDM, on the other hand, is the world of the more structured, more known, more governed, more managed. Data stewardship, that's another thing. Customer data platforms typically don't enable any form of stewardship. You get what you get. The matching is highly deterministic and rather rigid, right? Which is, we're going to go off of keys, device IDs, cookie IDs. We'll use that. Aha, we got a match on a device ID. Poof, here's your customer master record, right? Where you can't necessarily turn those dials and where there is no data stewardship from a human review perspective to say, okay, is this the right decision that's being made here? MDM, on the other hand, is the world of stewardship. It's the world of governance rules. It's the world of configurability, where you can turn the dials on your match algorithms, where you can manage and configure the business rules, the governance policies that are used to make decisions about what is a customer master record and what isn't. Generally, in this world, the cost of being wrong can be very high, right? Where you want more structure, where you want more oversight of that matching, where the matching tends to be more probabilistic, where it's algorithmic, right? So these are two different worlds. What I'm seeing most of the time here, guys, is that it's not a choice of either or. Generally, for most companies these days, it's a question of both. Where what you could envision here is an arrow going from the right-hand side, the master data management oval, an arrow over to the left. This is what I would tell my clients all the time. Customer data platforms can live, and they're fine to exist on their own, largely kind of in a, dare I say, silo. But if there's an integration there between an MDM hub and a customer data platform, where the customer data platform is deferring to the MDM as a source of truth, as a system of record for customer records, these systems can absolutely positively live in harmony.
Yeah. And the thing that I think that is a key consideration here is that the MDM platform should inherently be multi-domain, not just focusing on customer, but there to cover many domains and reference data and solve use cases well outside of just the customer 360 kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, interesting though, in the kind of the world of CDPs, a lot of the multi-domain requirements are actually being fulfilled by a combination of CDPs and kind of data syndication platforms from a product perspective. So where MDM can do both. So totally agree.
All right, so we have 10 minutes left, and there's a lot of questions that didn't fit into those buckets, so I'm going to just kind of quickly rattle through a lot of these, and just bear in mind we've got 10 minutes. Yep. So why did you join Profisee?
I wrote a blog about this, so I will defer largely to the blog, but the short answer here is I knew the people. I like the people. I like the culture of the company. I like the strategy. I like where Profisee is going, and I love the role. It was the role of an MDM evangelist. As you guys can tell, I'm pretty passionate about this space. So in terms of a job, this isn't a job. This is kind of a dream scenario for me. So it was a perfect fit of all three.
So in other words, we're paying you too much. Is that what you just said?
You're breaking up. Sorry? What?
Okay.
I didn't get that.
What's your take on data virtualization technologies within the context of architecture fabric governance? I think we touched on this a little bit.
Yeah, we did. I mean, you can use virtualization technologies to kind of move data around to ease some of the data integration load that would be inherent to any of these platforms. I think you could argue that the data fabric is highly reliant on some form of data virtualization, where a lot of the processing is happening where the data rests instead of in single hubs of data. I think that would be consistent with the data fabric pattern. But at the end of the day, again, I mean, garbage in, garbage out. If you've got a lot of bad data that is sitting in source systems, data virtualization is a great way of automating and easing some integration patterns, but that bad data will wreak havoc no matter what.
How can we get started on formulating a data plan? Do we need a specialist?
Chances are, yes, you do need some form of a specialist. Now, I don't know exactly what you mean by a data plan here, but let's assume that means that you have aspirations of becoming more data-driven, having a more data-driven culture, putting together some strategy around your data management. If that's what you mean by kind of a data plan, I would defer back to the very first and second slides that I shared in relation to understanding what success looks like. The key to becoming data-driven is being able to tie your efforts from a data management perspective back to the delivery of specific business outcomes. That's step one. Have conversations with your stakeholders about how the data is not serving their business process needs, is not serving their goals. That's step one. You go from there.
What's the best way to maintain data privacy throughout an MDM system development and deployment?
It's a good question. I mean, MDM platforms, including Profisee, have a degree of data privacy and security. At the end of the day here, this is really all about your data governance program and defining acceptable use rules, defining the policies and procedures related to data privacy, and then having the technologies in place that can help enforce and automate and manage some of those business rules. The best way to maintain privacy, this kind of does speak to kind of SDLC and development of solutions as well. How do you, I think what's being inferred here is how do you make sure that individual engineers that are writing code make sure that those governance policies are being adhered to? Well, first and foremost is you have to have governance. Secondly, you have to have the policies defined. Thirdly, more than likely, you should have some form of technology to help enforce and distribute and manage those privacy and security rules, whether that's MDM or whether that's some other technology. In the case of the SDLC and actually writing software, it's probably something else that I'm not as much of an expert in.
Okay. What are the things to look for in a good MDM and RDM tool? Reference data management is RDM.
Yep. Well,
not explaining that to you, just for anybody else.
Well, so when I was writing Magic Quadrants, we figured out what was good and what wasn't good, and there was a list of 13 things called the critical capabilities that MDM's tools have to do. I could probably spend an hour going into detail about what those are. You know, they speak to data stewardship, they speak to data governance, they speak to workflow management, they speak to data modeling, they speak to hierarchy management. I could keep going here and take up every minute that we've got left. But beyond that, what's good for you may not necessarily be good for others. So I would look back to, that strategy and that approach that we talked about at the very, very beginning. Do you need to spend $4 million on an MDM tool, or could you spend something less to fulfill 70 to 80% of your requirements here?
Yeah.
Don't look for
I'll
perfection.
just point out
Go ahead.
we have on our website, we have a template RFP tool that has all of the potential capabilities listed out. You can weight them and do your own analysis around that.
Oh, thanks, Martin. That's good. Yep.
If we're seeking a multi-domain MDM solution that allows us to quickly implement data models without a lot of heaviness and complexity, is Profisee a good choice?
Yes, absolutely. It's a great choice for that, right? And data modeling, that is one of the critical capabilities we were just talking about, and the ability to define custom tables, custom data models, absolutely well supported by Profisee.
Should data be migrated centrally, or should we be more virtualized and hybrid? I think we talked a little bit about that already.
Yes. I'm seeing both. I'm seeing both, right? Like even for companies that are saying we're all in on Azure, those companies still have hybrid environments where there is still data sitting in, for whatever reason. Maybe it's a licensing issue, maybe it's a privacy or a compliance related issue. Whatever the issues are, most of the environments that I'm seeing these days are hybrid, with lots of data sitting in the cloud, but a decent amount of it still sitting somewhere else or in some other cloud. So whether or not to migrate the data should be part of an overall data management strategy here. And a lot of companies are moving into the cloud, but most are still in some sort of a hybrid environment.
Perfect. I'm thinking we're not going to get to the end of our lightning round, but here's 3 questions altogether. Basically, how do you see Profisee compared with other tools?
Yep. All right. So I'm going to put on my Gartner analyst hat here, and I will tell you right now what I would have told you 2 months ago if you were talking to me and I was still working at Gartner. There's a few areas where a Profisee is a fantastic choice. One is a time to value. The speed of deployment. Profisee is a fantastic choice if you were looking for a quick implementation of MDM. Cost of ownership, total cost of ownership. Profisee is a fantastic choice from a total cost of ownership perspective. Microsoft, if you are betting on the Microsoft platform, if you're betting on Azure, Profisee is a fantastic choice. Usability, ease of use, user friendliness. Profisee, again, a very, very great choice here from an ease of use and user friendliness perspective. Across those 4 attributes, I was recommending Profisee as a potential solution to any of my Gartner clients, and will happily do the same today.
Excellent. Do you have to pick a single solution? Is there ever a hybrid scenario?
There is, but for really, really large global companies, right? Chances are I would bet most of the people on the call today would be fine with a single MDM solution, but there are some very, very large multinational global companies where there are multiple. Chances are a single solution will be good enough for you.
Okay. I have one other high priority question from the chat, and then we'll skip to the end here. Yep. Is Len Fink as handsome in real life as he is in his pictures? It's a critical question.
I assume that's coming from Len Fink. For those who don't know, that's the CEO.
How'd you guess?
That's our CEO, and yeah. Look, our time is almost up, isn't it?
Yes, yes, it is. Yeah. So I'm going to skip to the end here and invite you to engage farther here. Sorry if there's your particular question we didn't get to. There was a whole lot there that we didn't quite get to. But Malcolm has a pretty serious presence on LinkedIn, and if you engage with him there, he can answer more questions and more details. And as I said before, Malcolm's job here really is to evangelize all things to do with MDM, the value that it brings to companies, et cetera, et cetera. That evangelism can take place in public forums, or if you have a particular need inside of your organization to discuss this or maybe present to a small audience, that's something that we can, or Malcolm can engage with as well. So any final wrap-up words, Malcolm, before we hang up here?
No, really appreciate people taking the time. Thank you for the questions in the chat that I wasn't paying enough attention to, but as Martin said, connect with me on LinkedIn. Please connect with me on LinkedIn, and I will connect. Happy to follow up offline. put me in front of a whiteboard or in front of a group of people, and I will go anywhere. I will talk about MDM, the value of MDM, any of the things that we discussed today, whether that is on a Zoom call or whether that is in your boardrooms, whatever it is. My job here is to promote the use of MDM solutions within the market, and I'm happy to help you tell your story. So connect with me offline. Thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for all the questions that you submitted in advance. Really looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks, everybody. We'll hold it here. Hope this was valuable time for you, and hopefully it's just the beginning of our conversation. Thanks
all.